Well, I hope we don't get into any sibling rivalry this morning. I got two Millingtons joining us. We have Steve, of course. He's been here since 7 o'clock this morning on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. And his brother Kent joins us this morning. He's been a guest with us before on the program. We talked nuclear power with him, specifically thorium reactors, and we'll talk a bit more about that coming up in just a moment. And Bill Cawley with you, too, this morning until 10 o'clock. We're at 36, and it's about 5 minutes after 9 o'clock. And first of all, Mr. Millington, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about thorium reactors again.
Yeah, because otherwise it all devolves into Mom liked you best. So
he always had that situation where he had most favored nation status.
Well, but the gist of this conversation came about over the weekend. I was talking with Steve, and I noticed that we were going to have an appearance by Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, on 60 Minutes, and he was going on and on about how they're going to be building electronic charging stations all over the country. And I sat there and I thought, for all their talk about green energy, they still don't have the electricity to power it. So the most logical source, or the most efficient source, we always go back to, and it's nuclear. And I suspect when you heard about all of this too, that you were probably thinking, why are we dragging our feet? Why aren't we moving faster? What's the slowdown with all of this?
That's exactly right. We're very concerned that everybody's attention has been drawn to other sources of green energy that are much more costly to implement and to maintain and to provide the quantity of electricity that they're talking about. So, yeah, we're pretty excited about this new emphasis on these small nuclear reactors.
Well, I've been reading a lot about the fusion experiments, and they sound great, but unfortunately, you've got to have power, for more than a split second. That's all they've been able to deliver so far. And so that may be 100 years out before that technology is available. Could you sort of walk people through again a little bit what the thorium technology is like and what it does?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. Thorium reactors were developed and tested in the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. They discovered in the process of the almost 5 years that these reactors, or this large reactor was functioning, that the fuel was almost completely consumed. So there was very little residual fuel that needed to be safeguarded after it was extracted from the reactor. That, number one. Number two, it provided significant sources of electricity without all of the safeguards that are necessary for light water reactors. That is the containment facility, the water cooling, and all of that turns out to be very dangerous. And thorium reactors eliminate the need for that because there's no need for the water cooling systems that are really the source of the explosions. And so what happens is, with thorium reactors, you put a small amount of thorium with a salt mixture. There's 2 or 3 specific salt mixtures that, when combined with thorium, will actually heat that salt to the point where it becomes liquid. That molten salt then is pushed through the reactor in a process that creates this very hot mixture. That heat can then be run up against a heat exchanger that is hot enough to turn either water into steam that actually creates the electricity, or a new source of electricity from a CO2 generator that has been developed by a number of companies, and we have a design for that as well. So the real key to thorium power is that it is more useful in creating the heat that creates the electrical potential, and it uses all of the fuel so that residual storage of very damaging or very like the spent fuel rods, it just isn't required anymore. And so we get the power that's required, but we do not introduce all of the damaging or dangerous elements of a light water reactor. I might just add that part of the reason that the thorium power was not carried forward was because the fuel was so completely used that it could not be then extracted from the reactor and used to build atomic bombs. And back in the 1960s, of course, that was a big concern as we were building a nuclear stockpile. But that just wasn't really necessary then, and certainly isn't necessary now.
Could that waste, by the way, could you store it right on site? We talk a lot about Yucca Mountain fell out of favor 15 years ago or so, but could we store what little waste there is right on site?
Oh, certainly. For example, you could put use 1 ton of thorium over numerous years in a small reactor, and what you would extract at the end would be something about the size of a softball that has to be stored for 300 years, as opposed to the 10,000 years from the waste of a current light water reactor.
That's interesting. You mentioned that the huge size of this original research back in the 60s. As I recall, you told me that you could build much smaller reactors given today's technology and get you wouldn't get the same electrical output, but then you could have multiple generators scattered around all over.
That's absolutely correct. The technology back in the 1960s was all based on light water reactors. That was the technology pattern or picture that they had in their heads, and so that's what they developed. Now, since then, we've miniaturized almost everything, and the reactors have gone that way as well. Even the light water reactors that are being tested right now are much smaller than previous reactors. Now, when we talk about the thorium reactor, our little company has several patents been issued here in the United States. They are even the largest and most powerful of those that we have designed would sit on the back of a flatbed truck and be very mobile. But we could make them even smaller. For example, a 1 megawatt reactor would probably sit on top of a normal desk in an office. Now, you wouldn't want to do that, of course, but that's about the size. We're talking a very small installation that could produce enough electricity for 700 homes.
Got a note here from a writer that wants to know what would be the lifespan of these power stations, and what would be the expected cost?
The lifespan that we examined was for 30 years. And the cost that we're working with right now would be about $1 million per megawatt. In other words, a 1 megawatt that could handle 700 homes would cost about $1 million. A 10 megawatt, it would handle up to, say, 7,000, maybe even 8,000 homes, would cost about $10 million. Now, when you do the math, yes, the upfront cost is steep to actually install, say, a 1 megawatt for $1 million. But then the refueling costs would be minimal, because over a period of 30 years, you would probably refuel 5 times. And refueling 5 times would add about another $100. Well, at $1.1 million, 100 homes over 30 years, that's about $50 a year per home. Now, that's significantly less than people are paying today for their electricity.
That again was $50 per year per home.
Something between $50 and $60, yes.
I could live with that.
Holy cow! So we could have anything from one that would sit on an oversized desk in an office up to the back of a semi truck. How do we get that power to the user point? I mean, do we have to build a substation and wiring and high transmission lines and all that stuff?
Well, you would certainly have a small installation where the reactor would be located. Because the electrical grid is already in existence, you would probably put this reactor in a substation someplace. You would take a small amount of that space and then just plug right into the existing electrical infrastructure. There would be no need to build additional infrastructure any faster than, say, you're building as your cities expand.
So 7,000 homes, that would be 30,000 people about, right?
That's probably right, yes.
So in a city like Twin Falls, it's just approaching 55,000 total population, we'd have to have maybe 2 of those facilities, one on either side of town.
Right.
And we could get by with about $50 a year. Is that what you said? $60 a year?
Well, that would be the cost, and then of course the company that's going to run this and maintain it would have to have.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
So you would probably charge. Let's say if you charged $100 a home. That's more than going to cover the cost of installation and maintenance and operation.
That's
it would
per
then
year.
allow for the company to maintain and operate itself. But $100 a month or $100 a year for a household is probably a lot less than they're currently paying.
Probably a lot less than they're currently paying. Oh yeah, you got that right.
We got about a minute before the first break. I do understand that there's been some interest at INL. How is that? These things generally move at a glacial pace, but how is that going at this point? I mean, are you getting closer?
We've had some very productive discussions with people at both the Idaho National Laboratory as well as Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And their scientists are very interested in this technology. Again, as you mentioned, they move a little slower pace than what we would like. But we've had some very productive conversations with them. And there's a great deal of interest in these small nuclear reactors. Thorium reactors happens to be one of those. Some light water reactors are also in the mix that are small. But the small modular reactors are gaining a lot of attention right now, yes.
We've got more coming up with Kent Millington and also with Steve Millington, talking thorium nuclear reactors today. And again, if we're going to have a transition, as the government keeps telling us, to a more electricity-driven economy, no pun intended, but that's what it comes down to, is getting the fleet out there converted to electricity. We have to have something that's dependable. And when the wind blows or doesn't blow, that means it's not necessarily dependable. Bill Cowley with you, too, on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX. at newsradio1310.com. Kent Millington joining us today. He joins us once or twice a year to talk about thorium nuclear reactors, and we look to be getting closer and closer and closer to actually seeing some development of these things being done, because we just have these power needs. Whether we even go to an electric fleet of automobiles or not, power needs are going to continue to grow in the United States. Steve Millington joining us too as well. They happen to be brothers. If you've got, you find that being unusual that they have the same last name. 923 and Bill Colley, excuse me, Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And we're at 35. And Steve, you had a brother or a question for your brother.
JK, you've heard this conversation from Buttigieg that he wants to put in these charging stations so that everybody can take their electric vehicle and drive around and charge it at various locations. You suggested to me when we were talking yesterday, or actually it was Sunday afternoon, that there is a method, and you emphasized that this morning, building these miniature reactors and putting them at, I think you used the word, at truck stops around America?
I think that would be a way to do it, because there's numerous truck stops, number one, across all of the major freeways and major highways. And number two, they're probably within 200 or 300 miles of each other, which is currently the about the limit of the extent that an electric vehicle can run without having to be recharged. Number three, they have the space. Truck stops already have a large footprint, and so you could very conveniently, in a small corner of the truck stop, put in a reactor that would not only power the truck stop itself, but would also provide numerous charging stations for trucks and vehicles that pulled into the truck stop. So you wouldn't have to create, number one, you wouldn't have to create large footprint sites along roadways like is being proposed with the Department of Transportation. The other thing is, right now, if you think about putting in those charging stations along, I think the Department of Energy or Department of Transportation said they would cover about 85,000 miles of roadway. Well, if you're going to put in that many charging stations, you've got multiple charging stations at each location. You can't have just one, because then every car would have to wait until the previous cars go. You're going to have numerous charging stations powered by this electrical grid. The small modular reactor we're talking about here, your electrical grid would be localized to, say, the truck stop. You wouldn't have to run miles and miles of high-power transmission lines from, say, either a solar panel farm or a wind farm to the truck stop. Nor would you have to destroy the environment around the truck stop by placing those very visible items like solar panels and big high-power wind farm. You wouldn't have to destroy the environment to put them, because the footprint here is very small. I think it makes a lot of sense to look for these small reactors at truck stops all over the country, install them, people pull into the truck stops, grab a bite to eat, they're charged, ready to go to the next one.
I got a note from a writer in Wendell, and he points out, I think the obvious is that obviously it's cheaper than solar and wind. It's also 24/7, and that I think is the key. There's no downtime in any of this.
That's exactly correct. Once they're activated, that reactor would produce electricity 24/7 for at least 30 years. I mean, we put a time horizon on it for our own research. probably would function a little longer than that, but that's a very livable time horizon. And 24/7, you don't have to worry about rain, sleet, or snow, or no wind, which is very, very. You probably have 2 days of no wind up in Twin Falls.
Yeah.
You're right about that. we do have our share of wind, but we just as soon let the wind blow and find our electricity somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that's a very logical explanation, J.K. That these things could be located at. We were just talking a few minutes ago about all these truck stops. There's people from here travel to Salt Lake City often, and so let's take off out of Twin Falls and go to Salt Lake. Well, we charge it up here. By the time we get to Snowville, that's about 125 miles. We need to stop and charge that thing up. And there's a couple of big truck stops right there in Snowville. There's also one at Willard Junction, Willard Bay,
Right.
and a half a dozen on through Salt Lake and south. Great big one down to Spanish Fork. We could just charge here, and the next thing you know, we're in Cedar City, and then we're in Las Vegas, and we've just stopped at truck stops along the way. I don't have any idea how long it would take to charge the battery system in an electric vehicle, whether it's 5
They
minutes
do
or
have a
30
quick
minutes.
charge system that's available.
So
You can do that. It's usually a little bit more expensive, but
they'd-
if you had
they'd-
reliable power,
Yep.
that
And
might change that.
the people would still have to pay for the
Or you
power
just
usage.
swap the batteries out.
Yep.
We got to get
Boom.
to a break, but we've got more coming up with Ken and Steve Millington on this subject, and your comments and questions too as well. This conversation is going to continue until 10 o'clock this morning. We're almost to 9:30. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. We're at 37. Kent Millington joining us today. He's talking thorium nuclear reactors, and as I said, it's an old technology going back into the 1960s, but it's also incredibly efficient when it comes to production. And we were talking with him about that, and we have a couple of other questions before we get to the end of the hour. I know some of you would like to talk to him as well. His brother, Steve Millington, is here brokering the conversation today, and Bill Colley as well on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. Brokering makes it sound as if, his money is being exchanged, but I want to advise you nothing like that has occurred.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think what we're brokering here is who buys lunch next.
yes. We got a caller, and we're going to try to squeeze a caller in here during this segment of the program. It's one of our shorter segments. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to ask your guest how one would invest in that company.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question, one that's welcome to us, of course. If somebody is very interested in investing in helping us finish out the development of this reactor, they could contact me. You could get the information from my brother Steve up there in the valley, and we'd be more than happy to talk to somebody about providing some funding that allows us to finish the development and testing of this modular reactor.
Question I often get. Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
If you got something really important, I don't want to cut you off. Believe me.
No, I was just saying we would welcome that inquiry for those that are interested in investing and could benefit long term from the development of this technology.
Every time you join us, I always get people telling me for a few days afterwards, yeah, but what about the safety? Ever since the China syndrome came out back in the 1970s.
Or the Fukushima incident over in Japan a few years ago.
We get all these questions, and I keep pointing out that no one's going to be driving these things to Yucca Mountain, and nobody's going to be, they're not big towers people can aim at or anything like that. So from the safety standpoint, can you tell people why this is still a much better option?
The main reason this is so much better in the safety aspect is because water is not used to cool this reactor. This reactor is cooled by ambient temperature. It does not need the super large pressurized water system to to cool the reactor itself. This does not create that kind of heat or damage. Now, we talk about the reactors. Chernobyl is back in the news because of what's going on in Ukraine, 3 Mile Island and Fukushima in Japan. The reason that those places exploded was because the heat got out of control, and the water cooling system separated into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is what blows up. That's what happened in Fukushima. If you read that, the water overpowered the cooling system, and so the cooling system could not cool the reactor. The reactor then continued to produce the heat that separated the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen blew up because it's under pressure. That kind of safety feature is not needed with this reactor. There's no way it can explode because it doesn't have those features, and so it's completely safe.
Got a note here from a writer. Of course, he brings up the fact that this is a separate issue for a different topic, but he brings up the fact that, obviously because we have rare earth mineral issues, that obviously electric cars still aren't the total answer. However, I think the point we could make here is that these power plants you're talking about, this is about much more than just electric automobiles. This is about powering businesses and neighborhoods and giving people a break on, expenses and making sure that we have reliable energy because that demand keeps growing.
Yeah, J.K., you mentioned earlier that your estimates indicate these much smaller cost footprints associated with your reactors, and so let's forget the charging stations at every truck stop in America. Let's just figure out how to put a couple of 3 of these in Twin Falls County, and give us a good, safe alternative approach to electrical generation for our county, or for any county. Put 12 or 15 of them in Salt Lake, or a half a dozen in Boise. How can we make that work?
Well, it's pretty simple to do, actually. Of course, the reactor itself is a fairly complex physics problem, but the infrastructure is already in place to deliver electricity to homes and businesses. All you have to do is substitute the origin of the electrical power from a distant coal-fired power plant or whatever it happened to be, and then run that power for 200 or 300 miles, losing some of it along the way. That's not necessary. We strategically place these small nuclear reactors around the target market area, and there's always substations. There's always those kinds of facilities that are available that would easily accommodate
JK, I don't know whether you can hear the music in the background, but we have to go to a hard break. We'll be gone for just a couple of minutes. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Kent will talk to us some more about his Thorium salts reactors. He'll be here for the rest of the show.
And then you got to tell us why you address him by an abbreviation, too.
Okay, all right, I can do that.
The Millington Brothers with me, Bill Colley, on Magic Valley this morning. Also, Cal Thomas coming up, too, with his morning commentary. It's 37 on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. Kent Millington joining us this morning, and he joins us periodically to talk about thorium nuclear reactors and the possibility that they may be the bridge to our future when it comes to electricity generation. And he is the brother of Steve Millington, who's joining us in Studio 2 as well this morning. And Bill Colley on Magic Valley this morning until 10 a.m. It's 9:46, and we're at 39 on News Radio 96.1 FM, 1310 KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. And I think we went to break, and you were in the middle of a thought. Do you want to pick that up?
Well, yes, and I'll quickly finish. We're talking about placing these small nuclear reactors around population centers rather than just for electric vehicles, but for homes and businesses. Every city has available these substations where they currently bring in the electricity and have the infrastructure to deliver electricity to homes and businesses. By placing these reactors significantly in those transfer stations, no additional footprint would have to be created in order to accommodate the reactor. And you could just plug the reactor right into the existing infrastructure and deliver the electricity to homes and businesses.
We have a caller, I think, looking to join the conversation. And caller, you're on the air on KLIX. Go ahead.
Bill, can we ask your guest how far along they are with cold fusion?
Good question. Cold fusion. The experiments with that go back to the 1970s, and as I recall, some of those were fabricated. But it's still a long way off, isn't it?
It is still a ways off. There are scientists that are working on fusion as opposed to fission, and progress is being made, but I think it's still a long way off.
JK, define long way. 10 years, 20 years?
Well, it's been 30 years since the subject was brought up, for 30 or 40 years, and there's been very little progress. Now,
Okay.
that would depend on the number of scientists and the breakthroughs that they might be able to discover, but I would suspect it's probably at least 2 decades into the future, where thorium and these molten salt reactors are probably within a year or two.
Yeah, as I recall at Lawrence Livermore, they managed to get a split second of the energy out of the fusion, but obviously, that split second isn't going to power anybody's house.
No, and there's been some success actually in foreign countries. China is experiencing a little bit of success in fusion, but like you say, it happens for just a few seconds, but it's certainly not sustainable 24/7.
JK, I want to ask you a question. Some time back, we were talking about this, and you made the comment that there are many isolated areas within the world that could use these small reactors, and solve their energy problems. You mentioned Japan as one, and some islands within the Pacific as another, where they don't have a ready resource of petroleum, and so this could be a real godsend for them.
Well, this is a game changer for places like Samoa. For example, we've actually had conversations with legislators from Samoa and some of the leaders in the Samoan government. Currently, they import all of the diesel that they use for their diesel-powered electrical production. Electricity costs about 44 cents a kilowatt hour in Samoa, and that's probably 5 or 6 times what it is here in the United States. Now, think about the change. We've talked to them about the installation of some of these thorium reactors that would drive the cost of their electricity for their businesses and homes down to about 8 to 10 cents, more reasonable, closer to what we have. Part of the reason that country, for example, can't accelerate the manufacturing and be involved in other kinds of business, productive economic development, is because the electricity is so expensive. You move electricity to where it's more reasonable, and they have additional economic opportunity that they currently, it's just out of reach for them. The other thing is they currently import all of the gasoline for their vehicles. If you have electric vehicles and the electricity is at the reasonable cost which we could deliver, their total outlay for petroleum products for their nation would evaporate, basically, and give them so many more economic opportunities for development for their own people. And we've had a number of conversations with those kinds of island nations around the world.
Back in the 1990s, I had a conversation with a fellow who ran a regional economic development office, and the center of it was a large metropolitan area, and then several counties that ended up being suburban and rural. But he said the first thing when we talk to anybody about relocating a business here is not the weather. It's it's not crime. It's the cost of electricity or just power in general. So when you mentioned Samoa and you brought this up, it clearly indicates that's the first question anybody who's setting up manufacturing is asking about.
Oh, absolutely. They are looking for power sources that are reliable and inexpensive over the long haul, and this thorium reactor is probably the only way that I'm interested in, of course, but it is the best way, I believe, to produce that kind of electricity, sustainable, low cost, long term. The planning horizon for a manufacturing company could be much longer than it is currently with the electrical rates.
Well, one last thing that Steve and I were talking during the break, and well, maybe not the last thing, but we were talking about the fact that if I walked outside today, my future is looking at these wind farms south of Twin Falls and wind farms north of Twin Falls, which are going to be unsightly things no matter what. And all of I've stood beside them and listened to the sound too. It's legitimately annoying.
Noisy. Yeah.
So you eliminate the need for all of these giant pinwheels, so to speak, on the horizon, right?
Absolutely. They completely go away. They're not needed. And from those wind farms, you've got to collect and deliver the electricity to the population centers. We deliver the electricity right at the population center. It eliminates the need for expensive infrastructure development.
That one of the things that we're facing around here is these companies that want to build these huge windmill farms in southern Idaho. They're going to build a high power or high voltage transmission line from here to Las Vegas, Nevada. And they're going to lose maybe 25 or 30% of their total electrical generation just moving it down their lines. Whereas you're in a situation where you could put a dozen of these things in the greater Las Vegas area and eliminate that power line altogether.
Altogether, not only the unsightliness of the power line, but the cost of the power line, the maintenance of that power line. And so when you look at the total life cycle cost of the thorium power versus any other kind of electricity, it's very, very favorable.
I got a note here from a writer in Twin Falls that says, set one up in Atomic City. First place.
Yeah. You remember Atomic City's out next to Arco? And they have an old nuclear reactor out there. I have toured that a time or two.
There's not much out there.
There's nothing there. But Atomic City, Idaho was the first place that was totally dependent upon nuclear-powered electricity. They turned the power company off, and they turned the reactor on and run it for, 2 or 3 hours. And then, of course, they had to disconnect it because that was not their objective. It was just prove a point. But it was interesting to go through that thing, and no safeguards, no safety nets. The guys who put that together and made that thing work were giants in their field.
Got about 2 minutes to go. Kent, anything we didn't mention that you need to bring up?
Well, just to reiterate, the safety features of the thorium reactor are superb. They are not your dangerous light water reactors that everybody talks about when they talk about nuclear. Because they're much smaller, they're conveniently located, and the infrastructure costs are reduced, if not eliminated entirely. The safety features of the reactor are such that it can operate right in neighborhoods and provide very good electrical power 24/7.
I'm going to open my checkbook.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we thank you for your time today, and we'll hopefully get to do this soon again when we actually start seeing some progress.
All right. Be more than happy to come back and indicate to you the progress we're making.
Sounds great, JK. Thank you very much. Have a good one. See you now.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Hey, we've got a question for you, Steve. So, you use the abbreviation. That's obviously an old family thing.
Actually, JK's name is John Kent. Our dad, his first name was John Millington. And so I got Steve, but my second son or second brother was named John Kent. Well, instead of having Big John and Little John, we just went by Kent. As years went by, I didn't like the Kent thing, and I just started calling him JK. And it's pretty much just a situation between he and I. No one else that I know of calls him JK, just me. And so it's kind of a unique little.
I was a junior, but nobody called me Billy. I think my kindergarten teacher called me Billy, and my dad was Big Bill because he's about 6.5 feet tall. And so they decided they gave me a nickname. My sister couldn't pronounce brother when she was a little girl. She'd say Bumper. So I was known as Bumper or Bump all through my childhood and growing up in my hometown, and even teachers. And I had cousins who didn't know my real name until they were adults. Uh,
Well, that happens
my
often.
mom said, we're not going to call him Junior anyway.
Yeah.
So it was going to be Bob, or it was going to be William Robert, right? It was going to be Bob, or it was going to be the nickname, and I got stuck with the nickname. Steve Millington, we'll do this again next week.
Yes, we will. It'll be great. And by next week, we should be living a lot more relaxing because the legislature is going to sine die on Friday night. Yay, when the legislature goes home, we can all sleep better at night.
Hey, we've got to take a short break for me, 20 hours, God willing, at the Creektown Rise. I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 6 and 10 a.m. Bill Colley saying, Dan Bongino's coming up next. Hey, that's pretty good. But after the news. And by the way, we're up to 38, and it's 9:58 on KLIX.